We can get underway, I think.
It's nice. Are you really a fan? Seriously? Oh, yeah.
Are we rolling in the back there? Yes, good, excellent. Good afternoon. I'm Bill Shambra, Director of Hudson Institute's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. Kristen McIntyre and I welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled Don't Forget the Motor City, Philanthropy and Detroit. We're proud to co-host today's session with the Journal of Record for the World of Foundations, the Chronicle of Philanthropy. Almost half a century ago, when Martha Reeves and the Vandellas released their eternal Motown hit, Dancing in the Street, yes, my fellow boomers, it's been almost 50 years. It seemed highly unlikely that anyone needed to be reminded not to forget the Motor City. Just 3 years earlier, in 1961, it had elected a photogenic progressive mayor, Jerome Kavanaugh, whom many likened to JFK himself, with a promising national political career ahead of him. He had been elected with 85% of Detroit's African-American vote, buoyed by his promise to end police brutality and commence a new era of racial harmony in the city. This promise was backed up by millions upon millions of the Great Society's urban redevelopment dollars as Detroit basked in LBJ's favor. And of course, Detroit could look forward to the private largesse of some of the nation's largest foundations built on local fortunes, among them the Ford, Kresge, and Kellogg foundations. Today, of course, we're still unlikely to forget the Motor City, but for very different reasons. With its tens of thousands of abandoned structures, non-working streetlights, government services slashed to the bone, alongside bulging pension and health care costs for retirees, and finally, the largest municipal bankruptcy in the nation's history. Detroit has achieved international renown as a symbol, perhaps, of Western decay and decline, attracting visitors from around the world to gaze upon what's become known as ruin porn. And yet, as Suzanne Perry's article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy reminds us, Detroit continues to benefit from a reasonably healthy philanthropic sector. Foundations seem to be doing their utmost to reverse or at least remediate this decay, providing some $628 million in private support for the city over the past few years. The prominent role foundations will likely play in Detroit's future was strikingly illustrated by two events in its local news yesterday. Detroit elected a new mayor, no big deal since the city is being run by an unelected emergency manager anyway. But also on Tuesday, an event probably of greater moment for Detroit occurred when the federal judge overseeing the bankruptcy process held a closed-door meeting with the leaders of all the foundations engaged in the city, including some not located in the city, including the Knight Foundation from Miami and the Ford Foundation from New York. I'm pleased to say that one of our panelists today represents a foundation present at the meeting, and she will give us a Bradley Center exclusive report on the contents of that meeting. Not really. But questions arise. Is enough being given by philanthropy? Is it being given in the right amounts to the right groups, in the right parts of the city, for the right purposes? And is philanthropy becoming a de facto unelected junta governing the city while the official elected political institutions languish? These and no doubt many other questions will be tackled today by our expert panel, which includes the Chronicle of Philanthropy's Suzanne Perry, plus three people whom she interviewed for her stories. Tanya Allen, CEO of Detroit's Skillman Foundation, Michael Lefebvre of the Mackinac Center. Full disclosure at this point, I once spent my allowance on candy in the converted Five and Dime where the Mackinac Center is now located in Midland, Michigan. And finally, Paul Light, professor at New York University and a prominent commentator on the world of nonprofits and foundations. After the opening remarks, we have a special treat. Rick Cohen, familiar to many of you in his current role as a writer for the nonprofit Quarterly, will react to the presentations based on his longstanding work with and connections to the neighborhoods of Detroit, which he will no doubt explain when he begins his remarks. So, Suzanne.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes, okay. Thanks to everybody for joining this discussion on what I find one of America's most fascinating cities. After Detroit filed for bankruptcy protection in June, the Chronicle of Philanthropy decided to take a look at it through our particular niche. What has philanthropy been up to there, and can it make a difference? I went to Detroit for a few days. I spoke before and after that to foundation people, community activists, and outside experts, and I finally concluded this was going to be one of the most challenging assignments I'd ever had at the Chronicle, or maybe anywhere, because it's so complex and there's so many possible angles to explore that affect both foundations and nonprofits that I knew I'd only be able to scratch the surface given my time and space constraints. So I speak today with some humility. I can't claim I'm an expert on Detroit, but I can offer a glimpse of some of the themes that I encountered that should be of interest to anyone working in philanthropy, whether in Detroit or elsewhere. First, to put things in context, I couldn't help comparing Detroit to another distressed American city that I covered a bit after Katrina, New Orleans. And I remember the feeling there that the whole country had rallied to rebuild New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. The federal government, loads of nonprofits and foundations, backed by an aggressive fundraising campaign. You might remember that even Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush set up a Katrina fund. I know the comparison is not entirely apt, as there's a difference between a city destroyed by a specific disaster and one that's suffering from some very deep-seated economic and political problems that have built up over half a century. But the point remains that while the federal government has taken some small steps to help Detroit, basically the city has been left pretty much alone to rescue itself. And that has put extra pressure on philanthropy to do what it can. A number of people that I interviewed made comments along the lines of Detroit is the canary in the coal mine. In other words, it's not alone in suffering some of these problems of poverty, high crime, unemployment, shaky city finances, but it's certainly gotten the most attention. Detroit has an active foundation community, both national and local. We asked the Foundation Center to calculate how much grant makers had spent in Detroit over the most recent 5 years for which data were available. And they said it was $628 million from 2007 to 2011. The biggest by far donor was the Kresge Foundation, which is based in Troy, Michigan. They spent $135 million plus additional grants through the Community Foundation for Southeast Michigan over that period. The Skillman Foundation, a local grant maker represented on this panel today by Tanya Allen, was also a big contributor, came in third, followed by the Ford Foundation and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Just an aside about the Ford Foundation, you might remember that the Attorney General was putting pressure on the Ford Foundation in 2006, saying that it had ignored the Ford family's philanthropic wishes by not spending enough on Michigan charities. And whether it's related to that inquiry or not, the foundation has stepped up its spending in Detroit, and the city now gets the biggest share of its what they call the Metropolitan Opportunities budget. Part of the spending has come in the form of a $100 million pool of money that was put together by the five foundations that I mentioned: Community Foundation, Skillman, Kresge, Kellogg, and Knight. And anyway, it adds up to 10. They put together $100 million to promote entrepreneurship. And the idea was that Detroit needed an alternative to automobile-related jobs. Obviously, those are long gone. So they've been giving money, just as one example, to Wayne State University has something called Tech Town, which is a business incubator. The most visible signs of the philanthropic effort in Detroit are some of the revitalization efforts in the greater downtown area. In 2003, Kresge made what it was its biggest grant to a single project in its history. Okay. To help develop this $50 million, biggest grant to a single project in its history to help develop Detroit's riverfront. The riverfront was once apparently just pockmarked with abandoned buildings and rusted out cars and a place that nobody really wanted to hang out in. And that project also got support from Ford and Kellogg, along with a lot of business interests. And there is some evidence that that project is paying off economically, as well as drawing a lot of people to walk by the river who never would have done so before. A recent economic study found that it had helped to generate more than $1 billion in public and private investments, almost 17,000 construction jobs, and $4.5 million in annual tax revenue during the last decade. Now that project, the Riverfront project, was followed by a lot of giving to other revitalization projects, both downtown and in the Midtown area, which houses Wayne State University, Detroit Institute of Arts, other museums, an urban food market, and now, and what is seen as sort of a marker of a neighborhood that has arrived, even Whole Foods has set up there. Kresge is also putting $35 million into a light rail project that's going to tie into a broader transportation network in Detroit. So while as a newcomer it was hard for me to gauge how important these things were, I did talk to people who said that Detroit is really a different city now than it was 5 years ago, partly thanks to these foundation efforts. Another area that was a bit stronger than I expected was the arts. Probably a lot of you read stories about the possibility that the Detroit Institute of Arts would have to sell some of its masterpieces to help the city pay its debts. So I went in thinking I was going to write a kind of downbeat story about how the arts are really suffering from the Detroit's financial problems. But it turns out that, at least partly because of a lot of big foundation spending, it's one of the biggest categories of spending that turned up in that survey that the Foundation Center did, something like $120 million. The arts are at least surviving better than they are in some other cities. I mean, they got through the recession. There's been no major failure like the New York City Opera going bankrupt. So that was one of the main challenges I found in covering this story. You have these kind of optimistic beacons, like things that seem kind of shiny, but putting those against the challenges that are being faced in Detroit's neighborhoods, where because the population has shrunk so much, there are loads of abandoned buildings, as Bill has already talked about. There's blight. The street lights are not working because the city is too poor to provide decent services, police, firefighters, buses. These neighborhoods are really struggling. So I decided going into the project that I wanted to talk not only to foundation leaders, but also to community activists who could speak on behalf of the city's residents, because I discovered in doing research for this story that there's some tension between what the urban development projects and the people out in these distressed neighborhoods who are wondering who's making these decisions and what's going to happen to me, and am I going to have to move because there's talk about shrinking the city and that kind of thing. So it was a bit of a challenge because to find people who, or I wanted to find people who could speak frankly, and of course a lot of community activists get foundation money, or they hope to get foundation money. And one person told me specifically she didn't want to be quoted criticizing grant makers. But I was able to speak to a handful of folks. Some of them were grantees, some not, but they were pretty frank. One of my favorite quotes was from a Hispanic leader, Angie Reyes, who said she really enjoys the new vitality in downtown. She went to a jazz festival and she couldn't believe all these families were walking around with dogs and strollers and that kind of thing. But then she added, it feels like somebody took a piece of another city and plopped it into the middle of a donut hole. And you walk through a glitch in the matrix and you go into this different reality, because when you go out into the neighborhoods, it's very, very different. So I think one of the biggest challenges for philanthropy going forward is figuring this out, how to develop the city in a way that takes into account all of the residents. Kresge, Ford, Kellogg, other foundations helped pay for a big exercise to get residents involved in planning. It was an exercise called Detroit Future City, which has come up with a framework for kind of dealing with all this extra space. It envisages repurposing large amounts of vacant land, for example, into things like farms and forests and recreational areas. But it'll be interesting to see what happens next, especially given the election. There's a new, Mike, to see how the new mayor views all of this. I'd like to mention a couple of themes that I picked up in Detroit that apply to philanthropy more widely. One is fiscal austerity. We all know there's no mood in Washington or in many states for much new spending. Governments are calling for increasingly on foundations to help fill the gaps. In Detroit, for example, foundations are helping to pay for something called the Education Achievement Authority, which is a private entity that Governor Rick Snyder created in 2011 to take over the state's worst performing schools. And just on a much smaller level, Kresge chipped in with some businesses to help the city buy police and emergency vehicles. Foundations like Skillman are helping to clean up the blight in the city, as you might have read in the little sidebar I did on the Detroit Blight Authority. And so it raises a question which I hear often when I'm covering stories of different kinds. How much can philanthropy be expected to do to fill in for what government has traditionally done? The other theme that came up was question of public accountability. When you have a sort of weak, financially strapped city, and it gives businesses and foundations maybe an outsized influence. And there's been some tension about that in Detroit, like who's calling the shots, who's in charge here. In addition to the foundation spending, there is a lot of private investment going on, most notably by Dan Gilbert, who's chairman of Quicken Loans, the mortgage lender. And he has been buying up, refurbishing, and leasing just all kinds of commercial buildings in downtown. So in an opinion piece for the New York Times in February, Mark Bonelli, who's a Rolling Stone contributor and an editor about a book about Detroit, used this term unelected oligarchy. And he said that, that Detroit was not only had an emergency manager who wasn't accountable to the public, but also had these unaccountable corporate and foundation interests. I mentioned that term, unelected oligarchy, to a couple of civic activists, and they kind of chuckled and said, yeah, that's about right. Even Rip Rapson, Kresge's foundation, when I bounced that term off of him, he said there's some legitimacy to that argument, and that it really made it imperative for foundations to be as open as possible about what they're doing, their motives, their funding flows. And he said that they'd taken their hits on talk radio and other public forums about this very issue. So just to, for my final thought, I'm going to quote Mr. Rapson again, because I checked my notes when preparing this presentation, and since he wasn't able to be here today, I found something he said that I think kind of synthesizes what the real challenge is for philanthropy in Detroit. He said that Kresge and other foundations are trying to create the essential building blocks for a return to health. But he said the question of whether we're building something that can be sustained is huge. And my sense is the answer is that philanthropy has to build the scaffolding and that it's susceptible of being absorbed by the public sector when it's able and ready. So I think that is the open question. Will all this scaffolding take hold, especially now that we're entering a new chapter with a new mayor who, by the way, has already made a comment that he does not approve of outside, what he called planning activities being outsourced to nonprofit groups like the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, which has received a lot of grants from these foundations. So I think going forward, it'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. Chronicle of Philanthropy will be following it. And now I look forward to hearing from the real experts. Thank you.
Okay. Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tanya Allen. I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Executive Officer for the Skillman Foundation. And the Skillman Foundation is a children's foundation in the city of Detroit. We're 50 years old. And our main focus is to make sure that we improve the life outcomes for kids in the city of Detroit. So, as you can imagine, that's a big ambition. And probably about 6 or 7 years ago, actually about 7 or 8 years ago, we really changed the focus of the foundation because we had invested literally millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in programs that did support and improve the outcomes for a select number of kids. But those outcomes were pretty discrete. So while we were supporting these discrete activities, what we found simply was that the lot of Detroit's children was getting worse. And so we really reshifted and changed our focus. And I think in a lot of ways, we were probably the first foundation in the city of Detroit to have this more embedded, hands-on approach and really digging into the conditions and trying to shift the conditions that we thought would improve outcomes for kids. So just using that as backdrop, I decided that I was going to put on my crown for the day and decide that I was going to give you a talk about what I think, how we should be thinking about philanthropy in Detroit. And I think it's a mixed bag, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about that. But first I would say, I think that philanthropy in Detroit should be heralded. Not because we've been extraordinarily successful, but because we have been present. We did not shrink at adversity, volatility, uncertainty. We did not shrink at risk, ambiguity, or criticism. Rather, I think philanthropy in the city of Detroit has tried to answer this moral calling as well as this philanthropic calling to try and help save an American legendary city, which also happens to be my hometown. And nothing better captures this adage than this concept than this old adage that those who are absent avoid criticism. So unprecedented times, unprecedented conditions call for unprecedented behaviors and practice. It calls for unprecedented philanthropy. Local foundations like Skillman, McGregor, Hudson Weber, Community Foundation, Urban Fisher have been answering this call for many years with millions of investments guided by their embedded relationships in this broader historical context of the city of Detroit. And we've had many national foundations in the last 6 or 7 years who've joined us, including Kresge, Ford, Kellogg, and Mott. And they've adjusted their giving priorities and made this public declaration that Detroit is important. They provided some financial, intellectual, and political capital for our work that we've been trying to do in the city, and I'm grateful for their investment. What I think has happened in Detroit is that philanthropy has had to step up to fill this void of city leadership and a void of leadership by the civic class. So when I think about what philanthropy has tried to do in the last few years, it's a couple of things, about 5 things I would say. One is that we tried to convene the multiple players around a common vision and a compelling narrative in the city of Detroit for the future of the city. We have not always done a good job at that, and we're definitely not on the same page. But I think that in general, we were trying to figure out, like, how do we envision who we want to be so that the actions that we're doing today are going to be rooted in rooted in making investments in what we believe our future will be. The second thing is we've probably tried to cajole a stagnant and declining education system. And really, I think one of the first cities trying to grapple with how do you move from a school system to a system of schools that are unregulated and putting in place the kinds of things you would expect, like talent management, quality controls, that you would expect from one institution. How do you create that in this open marketplace? I think we have aspired to alter the economic ecosystem to promote entrepreneurialism, economic growth, and diversity inclusion. And I think we struggle with that. We don't know how to do it, but we are trying. I think we have supported the restructuring of municipal government and many of the systems that play in cities that are hampered and unable to provide important and very precious services to our city as well as to industry. And when I think about that, I think about basic things like garbage pickup or street lights. But I also think about more important things like early childhood and education or land disposition. I think philanthropy has helped cultivate the regeneration of downtown and midtown. We call it the Woodrow Corridor. They've done it in conjunction with lots of people, the meds and eds, the business community, the cultural institutions, and the community development industry, which is often left out. So it makes it seem like philanthropy put money there. No, philanthropy joined the party late, but we made some investment that expedited it. And then I think the last is that in some cases, we've created some constructive avenues and mechanisms for residents to bring their voices into this. It has not been wholly inclusive, but I do think that without philanthropic investments, that there would have been a very limited voice of the people engaged in much of the change that's happening in Detroit, especially as you think about the city is being controlled or managed by an emergency financial manager who does not have any responsibility to communicate what the vision is and why he's taken the city through such pain. So I wanted to just give a bit of context. Now, we've done all of those things, and then I'm going to critique us too, so I want you to get ready for that. Is that I think we've done all of that, and I want to just give this for a brief context, that we've had a stubborn hope for the last 50 years that we could reverse population trends and that we could sustain the infrastructure of a once very rich and wealthy place. We've done it with a local and a national economic downturn that brought our city and our major industry to their knees. We've had unparalleled population loss that nobody, even with us having 50 years of population loss, in the last decade, we could have never, there was no demographer who would have ever projected that. We've had these broken city services, patronage, as well as significant municipal corruption. We've had a retrenchment of state and government funding. So our social safety net is weakened and is even more undercapitalized. We've had churning leadership and the lack of stability at any critical entity that you could imagine, at the city, the police department, and the school systems. And then we've also done this all under the scrutiny of national media that tells tale and glorify all of our wrongs, but never talks about the kind of aspirational work or the resiliency that happens in our town. So I think the complexity and the confluence of these challenges in Detroit are pretty intense. And so I often say that Detroit is not for the faint of heart. And that this is the backdrop in which philanthropy is working. And philanthropy is pretty soft. So it's not that, we have this kind of unspoken politeness that doesn't allow for us to, a mentor of mine always talks about how philanthropy, we go into fights ready for a lecture, when the opposition is going in ready for combat. And so you put that in the context of this very challenging and vexing environment. So some question whether philanthropy has been successful in Detroit, especially when you think about the broader challenges and bankruptcy looming. In Suzanne's article, she talked about the $628 million that's been spent over the last 5 years. And this is what I think that $628 million has done. In some instances, it has stopped bleeding. So there were decades of problems in Detroit where we were just literally bleeding. There was always a decline. And we've stopped some of the bleeding. In other instances, I think we kept things stable when everything around us was unstable. So you could imagine the shifting sands that were happening in Detroit, and sometimes just keeping things the way that they are, even if they're broken, is progress. And I'm not making excuses for Detroit. I want to be clear about that. I think we've planted some seeds that we're waiting and we're hoping will bear fruit, that we've created some fertile conditions. And then in some cases, I think we've just made some pretty awful judgments and decisions and investments that were limited and did not have the kind of impact that we wanted to, and that we were responding to our belief that we could save Detroit. So I want to just say, I want to challenge the question about, has philanthropy really helped save Detroit? I think it's tremendous hubris in that question, right? Why do we believe that $624 million is going to save anything over 5 years after 5 decades of decline and broken systems? We assume that philanthropy is this kind of hub model, meaning that we control and command change through philanthropy. Philanthropy, in my opinion, is simply a node. There is some ability for connectivity, but we have no control. We are a part of a network that's required to produce change, but we aren't the solo players. And in Detroit, I believe that philanthropy, including my own, has made this fundamental mistake in believing that we are the hub of change. We need to guard ourselves against such arrogance and assumptions. And I could give you examples from 2 or 3, 4 years ago where I believe that. And as you go through this work, you become clearer, it becomes far more clear that how little we are involved in the change process in the city of Detroit. We can contribute, we can help scale some of it, but we are not the controllers of it. There are too many environments outside of us. And I think when we don't do that, we create more harm than we do good. And these are the kinds of cautions that, and they're reflective, I think, of some of the behaviors that I've seen in Detroit, especially around philanthropy. And I don't think that Detroit's philanthropy is only Detroit's philanthropy. Philanthropy in the way that we've had to step up is going to be coming to your town soon too, because it's really what you're talking about are urban challenges that are going to be prevalent across this country, and Detroit just has the confluence of them all right now. It's an expedited process. First is that we should not allow ourselves to have undue influence on processes that need to be and ought to be democratically controlled. And I think in Detroit we have done that. We have stepped in entirely too much. We have not only funded it for the public good, then we've advocated where we want it to go, and then we also advocate that those decisions go to institutions that we primarily fund. I think that is a fundamental flaw. We do not trust the people that we invest in. We fund people to improve and retool these broken systems, yet we continuously build workarounds. So the systems never have to test themselves, reform, and actually work. we continue to support and buffer the public system while we ignore the nonprofit system in Detroit. The social sector is weaker than it's ever been in the city of Detroit. One of the things when Suzanne was in Detroit, we talked about it with Angie Reyes, where she talked about her organization flipped its revenues. 10 years ago, it was 20% philanthropy and 80% government. Now, it's 80% philanthropy and 20% government. And as you can imagine, they can barely keep their doors open. We got to stop agreeing on this artificial politeness that prevents us from debating the complexity of these vexing issues. There is a belief in Detroit, and I think it's because we're so beleaguered and everybody in the country beats up on us, that we have to stand together. And we do stand together. I want you to know that we do all work together, but we do have differing opinions, and none of us are right. Like, the mosaic of solutions gets broadened when we debate and have diversity of ideas. And then the last is that I think we have to be more authentic in this work. We got to be more transparent about what we're doing, how we're doing, and when we're failing, we need to be able to articulate it without feeling like we're going to have repercussions nationally, that if we say we're not doing well on these things, that's okay. And we know that it's all at high stakes. And then the last thing is, we have to get away from this dichotomy of us versus them. Us being the people who know best and that we're going to create change, and those people who are against us because they don't believe in the change we create. I often talk about in Detroit, and this is my closing point, is that Detroiters are fatigued. They are often promised tons of change, and they never get it. And so they're always in this position of loss. And what I would say about that is they are already predisposed to say no. And what we have to do, I think, in philanthropy is help them and give them an opportunity to say yes.
Well, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's great to be here today and to have this opportunity to talk about Detroit, the city of my birth and still the home of many of my relatives, and to talk about the many efforts being put forth not only by philanthropists but by individuals to make the Motor City a better place to live and work, raise a family, and to participate in civil society. Detroit, in our view, in the Mackinac Center's view, my view personally, needs a lot more of this greater participation in civil society, not only from institutions, but from individuals. In short, it needs more of what we call from-the-heart transactions, and it also needs, in our view, less government meddling. We hope that the first of these might actually facilitate the second part of these. So important is the concept of civil society that the Mackinac Center actually named its first state budget study back in 1995, Advancing Civil Society. We almost felt compelled to do so because so many of our recommendations included greater voluntary and peaceful association as opposed to more a coercive model where we were recommending some other sort of mandates to be passed down. Organizing affairs in a civil society, as many of you know, requires intermediary institutions. Families, voluntary associations, religious institutions, and of course, philanthropic organizations, all working in a free market economy. This is sort of a view of a civil society as opposed to a political society, which often requires mandates, edicts, and often from expensive and distant government bureaucracies. My old friend Joe Overton and late colleague once tried to sum up his vision of what a civil society was or should be, and he used these words. I want to share them with you. He said, "In this environment, the creative energies of free people are engaged to solve problems as close to the source as possible. Resourceful individuals, strong families, and community institutions are looked to for the most effective solutions." That is the reason the Mackinac Center is so quick to applaud philanthropic efforts, whether it's in Detroit or elsewhere. We need these philanthropic institutions as well as individual initiatives, smaller organizations working really at a neighborhood or street level to help make Detroit a better place, and on many very creative levels, some of which I'll share with you in a moment. The Mackinac Center is also quick to sympathize with philanthropies, especially for those philanthropies investing in the Motor City, as well as individuals as well, because it must be difficult to choose from the many tasks they could choose from in a municipality that has been as dysfunctional as Detroit. Look what happened to Michigan philanthropist Bob Thompson back in 2003. He offered $200 million to build 15 new charter schools in a city where its infrastructure was literally collapsing around him. The mayor at the time supported it. The governor supported it. I believe the Skillman Foundation was going to offer curriculum support at the time. And yet pressure from one group, the Detroit Federation of Teachers, on the governor, on the mayor, and others, forced him to withdraw his very generous gift. Imagine that. Rejecting a $200 million gift to the city of Detroit for an infrastructure investment. Again, philanthropies have our sympathies. Now, that's just one example. Let me give you a broader picture of what they're trying to overcome here in Detroit. Those who have the broad invest in Detroit to help revolutionize the city outlook. When Emergency Manager Kevin Orr was appointed, he was required to put together a financing package, a description of the city's finances for its creditors. And he published some amazing statistics. When he took over, the city of Detroit was currently spending $100 million more a year than it was actually taking in revenues. It had an accumulated operating deficit of $325 million and long-term debts of $18 billion if you include pension obligations and debt owed to bondholders. All of these figures were tallied up in a city that was already at its maximum taxing limit in terms of property taxes, and which was imposing a Byzantine patchwork of onerous and very expensive, and some would argue unnecessary regulations on the businesses that remained. Detroit has the highest per capita tax burden of any city in Michigan, and by a margin. It also has, again, these difficult regulations. I would encourage you to go to reason.tv and look at some of the videos they've put up recently, because there is an interview with a Detroit entrepreneur who said it took him 3 years to get one permit from the city that would give him permission to put chairs and tables outside his cafe on the city of Detroit streets just for the summertime. And that's just one example, of course. Sometimes it seems, and I've worked with the city for 2 decades in doing research and acquiring information, that the bureaucracy itself is so busy strangling entrepreneurs it doesn't have time to answer the phone. That's my segue to the comment about services. Services in Detroit are lacking. In some cases, they're downright awful, and the local philanthropies have stepped in to help with that, buying police equipment, as Suzanne Perry's articles have noted. This is part of a toxic mix of high taxes, regulation, and poor services that have driven people and investment from the city. And well-meaning people and institutions they operate are working hard to overcome these issues, but in many ways, I believe, are swimming against a tsunami of incentives that are overwhelming their ability to do good. There's probably a better way, and they're having really their goals undermined, not only from private philanthropic work, but from public efforts to make the city a better place. Let me give you an example comparing some of the investments that have been made to make the city a better place versus what we've seen happen since the 1970s. Is everybody familiar with the Renaissance Center in Detroit? It's an iconic building. It was named Renaissance Center because it was supposed to herald a renaissance in the city of Detroit. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, they actually flew in the mayor of Florence, Italy, for symbolic purposes. Humorously, they had trouble getting him a visa at the time because he was an avowed communist, and we were still afraid of them back then. So they spent $350 million in private resources to anchor a rebirth of the city. Reasons to applaud. It was sold 19 years later for just $76 million. The message that sends alone to people who would consider investing in Detroit for business reasons or social and human reasons is not a positive one. The People Mover was supposed to bring people back in from the city. Today, it is actually less expensive to put every user of the People Mover in their own personal taxi cab to shuttle them around the city where the People Mover circulates than to run the People Mover, and yet it continues. By the way, Henry Ford, too, was at the Renaissance Center ribbon-cutting ceremony, and he said that day, "Detroit has reached the bottom and is on its way back up." Comerica Park and Ford Field are two of the more recent investments that required both public and private subsidies and were heralded as the thing that was going to renew the city of Detroit. In 2000, I had to repeat that number, Mayor Dennis Archer said of Comerica Park being built in Detroit, "Comerica Park will help restore the excitement of urban living that has been missing too long from downtown Detroit." Over the preceding decade, the city lost 250,000 people, 25% of its total population in just a 10-year period. That's important to remember because there's perhaps no better single metric for measuring quality of life issues than migration. For some reason, people vote with their feet, and in the decade of the aughts, they were not voting for Detroit, regardless of this very high-profile investment. In November of 1999, and in reference to the two-stadium deal that required public and private financing, a man by the name of Mike Dugan, who was a Wayne County official, told the Detroit Free Press, quote, 20 years from now, when people come back downtown, they will look back at this day as the turning point in Detroit's comeback. That was 14 years ago, and today in Detroit, they're arguing about making bankruptcy for the city official. Last night, that man, Mike Dugan, was elected mayor. I argue that it is not the flashy projects that will ignite a revolution, a renaissance, a rebirth, or a comeback in the city of Detroit, but to the degree to which governments and philanthropic organizations and individuals focus on what we call the microeconomic foundations of macroeconomic growth, that is, on the individual. I realize that philanthropists are already doing that and in very positive ways. One need look no further than the Skillman Foundation and their investments in neighborhoods. I've written about the private support of the wonderful Jazz Festival in downtown Detroit, and of course, of smaller organizations you may not have heard of. Have you heard of the Mower Gang or the East Side Riders? Individuals who are not only taxed to the max while living in Detroit and live under the regulations and poor services, but still give of themselves. The Mower Gang actually spends their own time and money and brings their own mowers to mow city parks and other city open spaces that have been abandoned by the city. The East Side Riders tricks out bicycles for young people in the neighborhood, creating a very interpersonal relationship with people in very small enclaves in the communities. In 2011, the first no-kill animal shelter was started by a former Detroiter who had gone into the city to make a documentary about an estimated 50,000 abandoned and wild dogs running in the city. He couldn't get a permit to film for the Discovery Channel, so instead he started this foundation to rescue the animals. He did so because there are only a handful of officers pulling about 40 dogs off the streets of Detroit every day. He said and 80% of them have to be euthanized. An individual working hard to make Detroit a better place. And by the way, these guys are so media savvy that they've already raised millions of dollars. One person donated $1 million in Coca-Cola stock with the sole order for Save the Dogs. That was her only request. I worry, however, that these from-the-heart transactions of philanthropists and volunteers alike are minimized by a city that punishes entrepreneurial and even philanthropic or volunteer initiative with that toxic mix of taxes and regulation and bad services that I told you about. To the extent that philanthropists wish to work with the city, it is my hope that they use their influence to push for broader policy changes that will help maximize their own grant-making efforts. In order for the city as a whole to experience that long-sought-after rebirth or renaissance, it must stop punishing people in business for trying to make a go of it. That means eliminating the personal income tax, for instance, making the property tax burden more competitive, and doing so while simultaneously improving services. Only when people and business feel safe again, economically and physically, will they return in droves. When that happens, generous philanthropists will be swimming with the tide and not against it. Thank you.
What do we have before you want to have some Q&A?
Give us 8 to 10 minutes?
No. I'll give you just a handful. Okay, less than that. This is a really great panel, really insightful. We've got very different point of view here. Suzanne wrote a great article, very deep investigation, which shows the role of journalism as an agent of social impact, actually, and we underestimate it. I mean, I look at Detroit, I've been a grant maker and I've been in government with the U.S. Senate and so forth, and, we've got 2 or 3 things going on here that we ought to just talk about. And we've got a failure of basic democratic institutions. The government of Detroit, the regional governments, the government of Michigan, the government of the United States have all failed in one way or another here. It's not just Detroit. It's not just within that community. What are we going to do about it? What is philanthropy doing about it in terms of dealing with fundamental issues of democratic governance? And how do we affect it? We have decisions being made here in this town today, tomorrow, next week that will have maximum and impactful damage, will create maximum and impactful damage in Detroit. Whether you think about that or not, I don't see many philanthropies stepping up to say, gee, we ought to fund some advocacy or education, we should call it education, about how decisions made in the United States Congress and in the executive branch might affect Detroit. It's like Detroit's a bubble, and we're focusing on it. So we have this failure of institutions, and how do we fix them? Yeah, we got an unaccountable executive in charge of the bankruptcy. We've got an unaccountable court. We've got foundations meeting with the court, the judge, and apparently accepting a gag order as part of the meeting, near as I can tell, because nobody's talking about what happened in that meeting. But I don't know, and I don't think we should call them out on it, but it's just an issue to say, well, what's happening out there? We have, secondly, a triumph of very efficient, and we might put in parens, brutally efficient markets. The jobs are leaving, and we can build light rail. And I was, there's Rip Rapson, who I've known for years from Minnesota, said that, we're doing something really innovative to move employees down to the jobs, but by the definition of an employee has a job. And so if you don't have a job, you don't have employees to ride the light rail. And so there's kind of a issue of proximate cause, and how do you deal with that? And I don't blame them for investing in light rail if you can't figure out how to create jobs. And the market is telling you that we're not going to create jobs in Detroit. Pulte left, and other firms leave, and how do you keep them from leaving? I've just got my fingers crossed that Detroit Tigers are going to stay, Yeah, the Pistons, yeah, sure, okay, and the Red Wings, But I mean, we don't. That's kind of morbid humor because I'm a diehard Tigers fan, and so we've got the failure of institutions, and it's great to hear that foundations are doing something about capacity building in the nonprofit sector. That's terrific. That's really terrific, and. I hope that there is money in the grant-making stream for strengthening nonprofits. And then we have weaknesses of basic policies. What's happening here in Washington? What are we doing with cities? I live in New York City. We had our crisis during a period where we had policies in place that might help, and we got our bailout, right? And New York is back. we're back, and we've got bicyclists running people down on the sidewalks and so forth. We're a vibrant city, and the question now is whether we've gone too far in another direction, and whether people of lesser means can now live within an hour or two of their jobs. And that's something that Bill de Blasio says he's going to do something about. We'll see. So, the basic question for me as I looked at this from afar is, when we talk about philanthropies investing in Detroit, are they investing in Detroit? And they should be honored for pooling all this capital, but what can they do about these big, wicked problems? They are really wicked problems, because this migration, this bleeding that Tanya talked about, it's very serious and very difficult. And there gets to be a point, and I know Tanya is not there, where the grant making appears to have a palliative character to it, that we're gonna grant make and we're gonna continue to invest, but we know the city is dying. And I don't think you believe that. I don't think you're at that point, right?
Right.
Right. Sometimes
I do like to wake up in the morning and be a bit hopeful.
Well, I'm very hopeful, but I think that if you're offloading all of the responsibility of philanthropy, you're the city of Detroit, and you're saying philanthropy is going to save us, you are in a palliative stance from the city's standpoint, not the philanthropy standpoint. So I was thinking about this as Suzanne called, and I was saying, what could philanthropy do? What could it do? What could it do? They could stop issuing these preening press releases, which you haven't done, saying, we've rescued Detroit, we're hitting the reset button, and I'm like, really? And you got to be cheerleaders for Detroit, but you can't be so far out there that it's not believable. And I think your foundation has been realistic and thoughtful in how you've communicated with the public, so that we don't get this deja vu all over again effect. But, from my perspective, it's a moment where we can test and push forward on using your endowments to create investment incentives for creating jobs in Detroit. You don't have enough money to do it through your grant streams. But if you were to create a pool of several $1 billion in investment capital for Detroit, could you do something there? How many jobs can you create with a $15 million grant stream through jazz festivals and bikes and so forth and so on, versus taking $1 billion of capital and putting it into an investment approach? You're free to do that with your endowment, and actually create some real money, put some real skin in the game, and give some competition to Dan Gilbert. He's a stand-up guy. He's doing well by doing good. What can we do to create investment capital to create the jobs that are going to populate the light rail? And I think it's a signal moment for some foundations to step up on that, because if there's ever been a moment where investment capital in the form of endowment funding, the huge amounts of money that are at our disposal in philanthropic land, that you can actually invest and say, look, we are looking to make deals for good jobs in Detroit. We've got the money, we're ready to invest, we think we can make profit, then this is the time. And if foundations don't believe they can make profit in Detroit, where are we then with the basic conclusion? If they're not willing to invest and put endowment in play, buy equities, make deals, make loans in Detroit, then we've got an answer to our question about the future of Detroit right there. So that's a challenge. Could we get the 10 foundations to put up $1 billion in an investment pool? Is it legal? How do we finance it? How do we make decisions there? How do we do it? How do we make it work? How do we measure it? And can it return a profit? That, to me, is the challenge. So before I hear and see another press release about what we've done to save Detroit, I'd like to see what we're going to do about investing in Detroit. that deals with the wicked problem of brutal markets. It might deal with institutional issues, but we got to work on those. Those institutions are still there. Anyway, that's where I'll stop. But just think for a moment. How do you make a $500 million pool of grants behave as if it's $5 or $7 billion of grants? And that's by investing the underlying endowment. And we don't do enough of that. And it's very scary, especially if you're a foundation that wants to exist for the next 4,000 years. At any rate, that's a good place to stop.
That's great, thanks. As I promised, we've asked Rick Cohen to give us the view from the neighborhoods. So, right? Yes? So here we go.
I didn't know I was going to give any view at all. But I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Detroit as a vice president of the Local Initiative Support Corporation.
Directly into
Yep. As a vice president of the Local Initiative Support Corp. Oh.
Bob Woodson is in the back of the room giving me a hard time, so come on.
Oh, okay. If Bob Woodson's here, I'll look. Okay, I'll stand. Well, I've spent a lot of time in Detroit. I've been interviewing people for years, probably interviewed 300 or 400 people, and conducted a number of focus groups since probably about mid-'90s. So I've witnessed a lot of the foundation initiatives that have occurred over the years in Detroit. So it was great to see the excellent series by Suzanne, and great to see this kind of panel. But the panel leaves me with a couple of questions based on that experience. And by the way, I have one other experience that may be relevant. I was sort of the political operator behind Jersey City, which was another lovely city that probably had all the characteristics that Michael is talking about, but Jersey City is certainly on the upswing that a New Yorker would see. So a couple of things struck me from this whole presentation that I wanted to raise. And I don't want to say that I'm giving a perspective from the neighborhoods, but I've been listening to that perspective. The first thing is that for the sense of democratic participation in an environment where, as Paul said, there's been a democratic deficit, I was kind of struck over the years, including my most recent set of interviews last year, that most of the nonprofits that we've been investing in or people have been looking to in Detroit are on shaky, shaky ground. Because despite all the participation efforts to get people to show up at meetings, the groups themselves are suffering. The sense that there's been an investment in capacity building isn't borne out by the fact that many of the longtime groups that I know of, Youth Snapback and many of others that have done tremendous work over the years and have stuck it out, despite the fact that Detroit's been in tough straits, they're really starving for resources, and they feel that the foundation community and the public sector have basically let them wither. So there's a real challenge in terms of what are foundations actually doing, not just to count people coming to meetings, but what are they doing to invest in the civic infrastructure of community organizations that are actually that infrastructure that would be mobilizing people more than just simply showing up. The second thing that struck me is that with Mike Dugan becoming mayor, he's the first white mayor in 2 or 3 or 4 decades.
Yes.
But in the whole discussion we just had, we've had no discussion really of issues of race, racial equity, the resources that have left the city and gone to the suburbs that were among the most exclusionary suburbs in the country, keeping, in fact, the bus system, I love the transportation system that used to end at, was it 8 Mile Road? That
Yes.
And did it connect in the suburbs, that you would take the buses up there and you'd go over here because they were explicitly designed not to connect for the city of Detroit. So you have a real question of what is actually being discussed or happening around racial equity, and how does that play in to these dynamics, the democratic deficit that Paul talked about, the kind of foundation dynamics that Tanya talked about. A third question that strikes me. This is not the first set of foundation initiatives. When Suzanne, you talk about $628 million invested over 5 years. I go back to lots of foundation initiatives under Mayor Archer. I led a team of 15 people to redesign the Detroit's land acquisition and land disposition system, and we interviewed 300 people just in that process. So this is one of many, many, many foundation collaborations, foundation initiatives, and foundation initiatives that were in many cases started by, what was it called, the civic elite?
Unelected oligarch?
Well, I want to come to the unelected oligarchy in a second, but there's been a top-down kind of planning in Detroit for many years. It's not like this is new. This has been going on for a long time. And therefore, there's some question about when does the community really get to use those energies that Michael talked about and bring them to the fore of the actual plans, which raises a fourth point about engagement. And maybe I see the press releases that Paul sees as well, but all these talks about we've had, X tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of people involved in planning processes. What does that mean? What does it mean for a foundation that's involving people in a planning process that's showing up at a meeting? I've talked to many of those people, the Angie Reyeses and others of the world, and a lot of them will say, well, we know we go to the meetings, but we're not sure really what happens with our participation, and we leave the meetings, we're still not sure what happens with our input. So there's a dynamic for democracy here that is critical to what's going on in Detroit. I would go to the oligarchy, the unelected oligarchy thing for 1 second and point out that that's not new. In most cities, in Miami, there was the non-group. In Cincinnati, where the former Mayor Blackwell just wrote an op-ed where he recommended that you sell all the Detroit Institute of Art materials. There have been oligarchic institutions that have run things for a long time. In many cases, Detroit's problems aren't because of the failure of community residents. It's often the decisions of that oligarchy, a corporate and institutional oligarchy that made decisions that were really focused not on the residents and the neighborhoods of Detroit and not on investing on great neighborhoods. There were some, think of Garfield neighborhood, you think of Boston Edison, you think of great neighborhoods that had a lot to build on, and they were disinvested by major decision makers. And then finally, I want to ask the question that I think Paul is also raising as well, which is, I remember reading a Kresge press release that announced the plan that was issued, and Kresge said, in order to make this plan work, we're also going to put $50 million behind it. But everybody knows $50 million is nothing. So the real issue is, what are foundations doing to build the capacity and to participate with community groups to do the advocacy around the issues that go from Detroit to Lansing to Washington, to realize that this is not a dynamic that occurred simply by happenstance, but it's been a disinvestment strategy that has been a public and private disinvestment strategy and needs to be countered by advocacy that involves community residents and community institutions, and not the kind of palliative concerns that Paul raised. I know you're short of time, so I'll make that real fast.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Rick. I want to give you all a chance to respond very quickly, and then we'll go to Q&A from the audience, and I will actually be the bearer of the microphone today. But one question for Suzanne, and Suzanne, as the reporter, can't participate in the vigorous give and take, but she can answer this question. And it goes to a comment that Rick made. The $600 million over the last several years, this is the tail end of a long history of many, many millions of dollars invested in Detroit. How much awareness, how much historical awareness is there among the people you discussed? And Tanya, you can answer this as well. Do you guys have any sense of where that money went over the years? Is there some official history of philanthropy in Detroit that one can go to and read about the 15 previous New City Detroit, all the initiatives, the major redevelopment initiatives that Michael was talking about? Is there any awareness of that, or?
I have to admit that's one thing I would have loved to explore but didn't. So maybe Tanya has a better idea.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's a record of all of those initiatives, but I do think that there's some talk to it. We talk about many of them, and I think a lot of the things that what we try to do is draw from some of those lessons, right? And then there's some things we just don't think about because the context has shifted so much. And so I think the point that I think you just made my point. Why do we think philanthropic dollars can really change the real demographic tides and the broken systems in this particular city? I just don't believe that it can. It's almost as if we think or act as if philanthropic dollars act in one accord, when we know that philanthropy is basically you're giving people, you're giving public dollars, you're using these public dollars, you're giving public protection to these dollars, so that they could privately manage them, that they could follow their own interests, not a broader interest. And I just think that when we start to talk about philanthropy as if it's just one approach, one strategy, and that all of a sudden everybody's going to get on the same page and we're going to sing kumbaya and invest all of it in the right way, I actually think that that's it's a great aspiration. Just show me any place that you've done it in philanthropy or outside of philanthropy that's happened. It has not. And I just think that there's this higher demand on philanthropy that we will do something different than any other industry, any other field. I have not seen universities pull together or professors pull together their knowledge to try and drive and improve a particular sector. How many universities, national institutions that have been in Detroit, using Detroit like a petri dish, including media, I haven't seen them mobilize. Journalism is great and it can be used as a social change, but let me just be clear. None of that has actually created any change in Detroit. And if we'd like to talk about it intellectually, you're fooling yourselves.
Any other responses? Yep, Michael? Paul? No? Okay, let's go to Q&A. Yes, please, this gentleman right here. Please identify yourself, speak very directly into the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Peter Gluck, and I lived for 30 years in another city in Michigan that is also economically distressed. It's Flint. It also benefits from the largesse of a national foundation, the Charles Stewart Bond Foundation, which has invested multiple millions of dollars in capital and human development projects. The thing that I think all of these comments overlook is that the problems that Flint and Detroit face are problems of inadequate general revenue, fund revenue to meet their operating costs and their legacy costs. They can't pick up garbage, they can't light streets, they can't put police on the streets. They're trying to service a geographic area, much of which doesn't even have any population in it. And I don't see what philanthropic efforts are going to do to address those problems.
Comments?
You want to go for, okay.
Yeah, I'll go next.
I think for years, Detroit has had a spending problem first, and now it's having a revenue problem because of all the debts and taxes they've been trying to, they've raised, or bonds that they've floated to pay for that desired spending level, and it caught up with them. And now they're in a position where revenues aren't flowing in because people have fled. I've read a statistic that I still need to confirm that said something like 30% of existing property owners in Detroit are not paying their property tax bills. There's a little memo in a meeting minutes from a water meeting last summer that said the water department sent out 53,000 pieces of mail, or 53,000 pieces of mail had been returned to them in the previous 6 months or so. Presumably those were bills that were not being paid. And so they've reached this point where dramatic changes are necessary. Will the EM and bankruptcy judge together bring them? It still remains to be seen. I'm holding out hope with what I've seen in Pontiac, because Pontiac, north of Flint, had an emergency manager, and he's wrapped up his work and gone home after having the budget. He increased the police force while saving $2 million a year. He avoided a major court-imposed tax increase in the process, and the city's taken back the ownership of the city and is moving forward in a positive way. So maybe that can happen in Detroit, and then the money that is invested by philanthropists and others in the city will go farther.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say, is that that's exactly right, is that what we're finding that's trending is that you're stemming the tide, but you're not fundamentally dealing with the issues that create these deficits. And so I will not ever defend the city of Detroit in our spending. Like, I could never do that. But what I would say, though, is that what we have not done is to figure out how to really right-size the system, because our infrastructure was so large, and it goes back to that point about being a very wealthy city at one point, where we could support it. But as well, there was some revenue sharing that happened at the state level that no longer happens. There's some significant policies that create this encumbering debt and expense on us that I think are important. That's important to note. And then the last thing I would just say is that I'm a big believer in resident involvement, resident engagement, that people can solve the problems before them. But where I kind of push on that is that I don't think that people ought to provide basic services that the city or government should provide. I don't think that they should have to that they need to carry their own trash to the dump. I don't think that they have to stand outside of their house and police. It's great if they do it. It's a good contribution, but none of us have to do that. And why do we have to give predominantly poor people? They have to do these additional functions and as well as kind of living their lives in the city. And so I just would caution around that we always place this responsibility. We continue to devolve the responsibility of our civic sector down to the individual residents. And I just don't think that's a fair thing to do to people.
Okay. Yeah, Paul?
Well,
Incidentally, Tanya, but maybe Paul can put his question to you about that multi-billion-dollar investment fund, which I think is perfectly legal, because it is, in fact, we've now become sector agnostic in the philanthropic world, as you know, and philanthropic dollars can be capitalist dollars and vice versa.
Look, every foundation, every pension fund, every university is having social impact through its endowment investments. Most of them don't know what the social impact is, but they're having an impact, and sometimes it's negative. So I wouldn't be surprised, although it's possible that the foundations involved in Detroit are pure, but I wouldn't be surprised to find some investments in the portfolios that are driving jobs out towards companies that are not invested in Detroit. But who knows? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We had that study of the Gates Foundation, and they're fighting to make the world a better place, and investing in companies that make the world not such a good place. But it's just a challenge to say, I think philanthropy could really step up on that, and I just don't know.
Well, I would say, Paul, I don't think that most foundations in Detroit, or probably in many of their hometowns, actually have investments that's dedicated to their hometowns, because people would consider it pretty risky to have a singular investment. But I don't think that that's a reason why we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying, I just don't even think you have a marker to go off of based on that. I think that one I would say is that Detroit has actually had several, we've started to do several investment funds in the city of Detroit that actually have been very profitable. Yeah. I mean, regardless of all of the challenges we talk about, Detroit is a good place to invest right now. Everything is cheap. And despite what Paul says, we do actually have a tremendous number of jobs that are moving back into the city. The challenge is that those jobs are not available for residents. You're just moving jobs through incentives, et cetera, from one place to another. You're not creating more positions. You're just you're moving those positions into those particular communities. And so I think it's a great challenge, and it's one of the challenges that Skillman as a foundation has been really thinking about, is how do we use our endowment in a way that would allow us to make investments that also allow us to contribute to Detroit, but also honor our donor's intent, which is, and she wanted to be into perpetuity. And so, that's the foundation's commitment, and I think we'd love to try and figure that out. And I think if Paul has some thoughts about like how you structure that kind of thing and how you make the investments where people are not losing their shirts, I'm happy to talk about it and champion it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the core question is, can you make a profit, the same level of return on investments in doing good as you can in sort of random dart throwing at companies that are doing well or equities that are doing well? And that's the real challenge of impact investing. People talk about it all the time, but it's got to yield enough gain so that you can stay. And if your goal is to stay in perpetuity, which is my goal, I mean, I wish to stay in perpetuity, but it's not happening. It's just not, but I'm doing well. So if that's your goal and you have to do it, then you got to make a rate of return. And my hypothesis is that you can make just as good a rate of return by investing this way, picking more carefully as you can by dartboarding or index funding, but I can't prove it yet, but I think we can get there. Anyway.
Yeah. And Michael, your point, I presume, which you could possibly repeat, would be that with this massively dysfunctional regulatory apparatus, all the talk about investing in Detroit is pie in the sky, right? I mean,
It doesn't have to be. I can see where private individuals investing their own money might make a return on investment. And there's still businesses left in the city, small and large. However, if you go back and you look at the high-profile deals that get all of the attention, all of them required massive tax credits and subsidies and other favors by more than one level of government, and perhaps even with the help of philanthropists to make it happen. That's not a recipe for long-term success and job creation in the city and for all incomes. When Tanya was talking about Detroit and making investments, I'm more confident in private philanthropists making investments because they're risking really their own money and their own foundation. I'm more nervous about when the state gets involved and says, we have picked a winner and this is it and here's where we're going to place our bet. She talked about jobs that weren't available for Detroit, and CompuWare comes to mind. It's an anchor company that everybody points to as one of the reasons for the corridor's rebirth. But the fact of the matter is it just transferred jobs from the suburbs to the city with no net gain on balance, and it costs state taxpayers money to do that.
Right, but it also costs us money to promote the sprawl, which also creates the disinvestment in the city. I mean, there are tons of policies that I think have created it. It's not just all about practice. I think for this city or many other cities, I would just add that.
We have time for one more question from
Pablo.
Eisenberg. Pablo.
Hi, I'm Pablo Eisenberg from Georgetown Public Policy Institute. Sorry, the School of Public Policy now. I have two questions. One, there's been a lot of talk by the panel about entrepreneurship, about privatization. You mentioned, Michael, charter schools, about the market. What's the potential or the possibility of public service employment that actually would target residents of the city, either funded by government or by the type of endowments that Paul is talking about? The second question is, and primarily addressed to Paul, what do you see the potential for real government reform, either funded by the foundations or by the business community? I mean, we've had a history of corruption, mismanagement, lack of participation. As the new mayor comes in, doesn't he need some help to really restructure the government so that it can deliver on the taxpayers' money?
Well, we are in an era of migration out of government in terms of policy making. You know that. It's a neoliberal a party out there right now. And we don't call it that per se, but we're basically saying our institutions are broken. Our public institutions, our governments, and our nonprofits. That's part of the conversation when you really get down to it, that these ancient nonprofits can't do it either. Therefore, we have to do it through the market, or we have to do it through entrepreneurship of one kind or another. Can we reform government? I mean, you do see some examples of where it's been successful, but these are all big policy questions that involve politics. I liked what Tanya said about how philanthropists and others, academics, go into these conversations, and we expect our adversaries to be nice, and they're not. Change is difficult, and I don't know what the prospects are. I thought that we might have an opportunity over the last 4 or 5 years to get some significant organizational progress at the federal level. States and localities, some are getting a lot better, some are not. So I can't tell you, Pablo. It's like, I was out with a friend of mine, and I said that I've been working on these problems for 25 years of government reform, and this person said, so how's it been going? I was like, well, I don't know. We're still waiting for the breakthrough, so I don't know.
I could echo Paul's sentiments. In 2000, I actually published a reform guide for Detroit because we saw some fiscal storm clouds on the horizon, and even warned that pensions could result in a bankruptcy in the city. And at the time, I calculated that there were 50 residents for every city employee in the city of Detroit, versus Indianapolis, which had 223 residents. Detroit's improved its ratio since then, especially in the last few years, but not enough. So I don't see Detroit being a center of employment for people in Detroit, sans assistance from outsiders of some sort, philanthropists or another unit of government.
Right. Well, I would just say in Detroit right now, we're debating whether or not we're going to cut pension benefits for retirees. And I just want to give you a couple of numbers to put it in context. Of retirees who are in the general fund, the average pension payment is $18,000. 46% of those people live in the city of Detroit. For those retirees who are in police or fire, 33,000 and 18% live in Detroit. And our emergency manager is proposing that we cut benefits by 80%. So I don't think that public employment through the city is going to be an option. But I do think that when you talk about race, I want to lift this up because I think it's an interesting trend that's going as government is retrenching across all of these levels. And you think about how people move into the middle class. In a lot of ways, it's actually through government, and especially true in communities of color. And so I just think it's important for us to lift up that we are essentially taking out pathways, traditional pathways, not that we can't have additional and new, but traditional pathways to the middle class for many poor and minority people across the country, and especially in Detroit.
Suzanne, last thoughts, since it was your article that got us into this mess in the first place here?
Well, I just thought of all these new angles that I can now. But one thing, I don't know if any of the panel has an answer to what, because there's a lot of talk about philanthropy can't do it on its own. What is the solution? I mean, I did think about this when I was working on this package. Where are we going to find some kind of answer to cities like Detroit and comparable cities?
Well, I think the burden, in my opinion, is on the people who live there. I think that we have to get past some of the kind of political infighting, and we do have to get some alignment on some of the approaches. But it's not just that we're not aligned. It is that the problems and the challenges are so compelling, and they're competing. It's a zero-sum game. I think the second thing I would just say is I do think that there is going to be we require some kind of intervention. And I know that's extraordinarily, nobody wants to hear that. But I think at some point, and when you think about the history of cities across this country and this history of cities across the world, when cities hit places like this, because this is not new. I mean, ours is just more dramatic. than many others, you do have some kind of federal or national, depending on what country you're in, some kind of investment that would help cities turn the corner, and then the full responsibility is on them. And I think we have to put that on the table despite the political atmosphere that continues to say that it's not plausible.
Well, we're going to have to end it there, so let's give our panel a round of applause.